talking about the Renters Reform Bill. And this is the biggest change in 30 years that we've seen in legislation. It is a sea change. But how did we get here? How did we get to this point?
Yes.
Why did government decide to, make such a drastic change?
Yes, there are just a couple of points really that you need to know to understand why we got here. So firstly, the private rented sector over 10 years or so have doubled in size. So the number of people renting properties at the moment in UK is about 11 million people. And in England itself, it's about 20% of households who are actually renting. So I'll let that sink in. 1 in 5 households in UK are actually renting a property. During that time as well, the council properties, they've been sold off and whatever, but the size of the stock has basically halved. So we had a growth of the private rented sector and people who need rented accommodation. And at the same time, council's ability to house those in need have diminished considerably. So what this resulted over the years is with the government trying to improve the sector, how it actually works for both parties by introducing various bits of legislation, creating a very chop and change situation, difficult to navigate.
Almost a bit piecemeal.
Absolutely right. But the voices have grown to the point where the government could no longer ignore them. And in 2019, Tory government promised to reform how the rental sector works, and that's where we are arriving now.
Yeah, and it is going to make it more of a level playing field for tenant and landlord. Although some will argue it is pro-tenant, what you're saying tonight is you're going to provide all the knowledge and in-depth wisdom to prove that different.
Yes, indeed. The opinions differ, and the way I look at it, rather than arguing whether that's good, bad for me or anyone else, it's important to understand what the changes are and look at your situation through the prism of that understanding and deciding about any adaptations you need to make. And I think it's crucial that every landlord does it.
And start the planning process now.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah. Right, okay. When do you think we might expect this all to come into force? What's the sort of timescale?
Yeah, so different dates were being talked about, but I think since the introduction of the bill into the parliament just quite recently, the belief is that it can get a royal assent likely as soon as spring next year. Okay. If that happens, what it will then mean to the actual process, 6 months later, it will become a law and it will apply to all the new tenancies starting 6 months after the royal assent. Mm-hmm. And then further 6 months later, it will apply to all the existing tenancies, even those who have been put in place prior to the bill becoming the law.
Well, actually, that takes us nicely on to our next slide, which is changes to tenancies, tenant and landlord notices. Now, having spoken to quite a few landlords over the last few months, the burning topic has been Section 21 and wanting to have better knowledge, better understanding of this and what the impact is for them. So, Suave, I'm just going to move the slide on, hopefully. There we go. Is it moving on? There we go. Great. So there seems to be a lot to unpack here. But, the burning question is, will landlords be able to get their properties back should they wish to sell, or should they want to evict the tenant for whatever reason? How can we, what's happening? Let's unpack it all.
Okay. Yes. Everyone, I'm sure, have heard, because that is the headline being led in the press and all the news, abolishment of Section 21 notice. The short of it is, yes, the notice is being abolished, but at the same time, landlords will be able to get their properties back. So just to quickly explain what's behind the headline. So Section 21 notice is it's so-called no-fault eviction notice, simply because the landlord does not have to give a reason why they want the property back. There are other ways already.
No fault eviction. They
That's
don't
right.
have to give a reason, and they can just evict the tenant.
That's correct.
And do they have to give notice? What notice
Yeah,
period?
they need to give a 2 months notice. There is another route for the landlords to look at, which is so-called Section 8 notice. However, it's a little bit more tricky at the moment, and most landlords prefer to use Section 21 notice. But because of that no fault name attached to the notice, that's why it is being abolished. At the same time, what the government is doing is reforming how Section 8 notice will work. They're introducing new grounds so that if you need to sell your property, if you need to move back in, or one of your family members need to move back in, you've got a tenant who is not paying rent and such, you will be actually able to evict your tenant. That will come through the reform of Section 8 notice. And there is a good news as well, Louise. The abolishment of the notice has been postponed for now to allow the reform.
Sorry, butting in there. Why? What, they talk about the courts? What's this?
Yes. So fortunately, for once, they have listened to the voice of reason being spoken by industry bodies, landlords, and estate agents, and they've decided to introduce abolishment only once the court processes have been improved. So actually, as long as this works as planned, we may result with perhaps there not being Section 21 notice, but with courts working much better. Because what is little known to those who are lucky not to have gone through that process, if you need to go to court to get your property back, there are places in country where you're waiting for 6 to 12 months for the court hearing.
Yeah.
So if they can improve those processes and you can speed it up, then I probably would swap Section 21 notice for an easier and quicker process every day.
Yeah. Okay, well, I hope everybody's quite clear on that. Again, any questions, if you want to speak to Sławek direct, that's absolutely fine. Just email him direct or post in the chat box. So rent increases and written tenancy agreements is our next topic.
So I'm so sorry, just quickly going back, the other two changes in here that we have are quite important. So the government is going to reform how the tenancies are working. There will no longer be a fixed period to the tenancy. So Louise, from the moment when this becomes law, the tenancy will start as periodic tenancy from day one. So that's a very important.
So there's no end. There's no 6 months.
Absolutely
where
right.
They're actually in a contract for 6 months.
Indeed, because right now most tenancies would start as a fixed term for initial 6, perhaps 12 months.
Yeah.
That will change. They will become periodic. What comes with that change as well is the fact that tenant who at the moment needs to give just 1 month's notice, they will be required to give 2 months notice.
Right, so the landlord's still 2.
Yes.
The tenant goes from 1 to 2 months.
That's correct. That's correct. So landlord will have more time to prepare, to advertise the property, to get it ready to re-let.
Yes.
What will be important, and there will be landlords who might be worried about a risk of having a tenant moving into a property, into their property, and perhaps moving out, 3-4 months later.
Say if they move out and then, of course, they lose their income if they've got a void.
Indeed, there is a risk of that. However, there is a fairly straightforward way to deal with that. So just talking what we do for our clients, there is a process anyone who applies for a property goes through, and through the expertise we have, we are able to identify the applicants who have the best chance to be a long-term tenants for our client. And that's what you will have to do. Whenever you look for a tenant, you will have to take that much more care in identifying those who are likely to be a long-term tenant. So from my perspective and what we do for our clients, I really don't see that change as being such a big deal as it might be made out to be by some press.
Yeah. Got you. Yeah. It could work in favour for the landlord anyway if he wanted to serve the early notice.
I think so. And ultimately, your tenant will have to give you 2 months' notice. And let's face it, tenants won't be moving willy-nilly from property to property. It's costing them money, and it takes 2 months as well to give a notice.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So let's move on to where there. That's it. Yeah. So rent increases and written tenancy agreements. What steps do landlords, or what can they take to increase their rents? Are there changes to rent increases? If there are, can you talk us through it, please?
Indeed. Okay, so just quickly to explain how the process looks right now. So depending on what kind of a contract tenancy agreement you have with your tenant, you may have been able to increase your notice by simply perhaps sending an email to your tenant saying your rent is going up from XYZ by £20 and it's going to be, whatever the new amount is going to be. And it's quite common way to deal with it. However, with the change, you will need to use a prescribed form, which is section 13, in order to increase the rent. So you will still be able to do that, but it will have to be in a prescribed form rather than just perhaps an email. And the important part here as well, the notice that you will need to give to the tenant would be 2 months notice. So as a matter of fact, what that means, you probably need to think about the rent increases that little bit earlier than you would have done right now, simply because of the fact that the notice is 2 months. So by the time you notify your tenant of the rent increase, 2 months later, it's when the rent increase will kick in.
Yeah.
So that's that's the change. And in terms of the written tenancy agreement, that's not a big change, really. Perhaps a little known fact is that you can have, Louise, a tenancy with your tenant without actually a written contract. Strictly speaking, that's not a legal requirement to have a contract. It's a good idea, but you don't necessarily have to. Now, the government will make it a legal obligation for the contract to be there, so there is probably little change for most landlords, but there will be certain prescribed details that will have to go into that contract. So we don't know yet how that's going to look like. We may end up with something what is being used in Wales, where there is a kind of a model tenancy agreement being used across the sector. On the flip side, there is a good chance it might make landlords' life a bit easier, as certain documents that landlords have to hand to the tenant currently, separately from the tenancy agreements, like how to rent guide, for example, they might perhaps be incorporated in the tenancy agreement. So I don't see that as a big change, and actually might make life a bit easier for the landlords.
Great. All right. Well, thank you for that then, Sławek. I think we're moving on now to one of my pet subjects, no pun intended. Blanket bans on families, on benefits, children, and our pets. And the thing is, with pets, they are a part of the family. And, if you have a dog and you move into a rental property and it's your companion, suddenly you can't have that dog with you. I can kind of understand that a little bit. But on the other side, I also understand that landlords, you're going to be worried about the state of your property. So what's your take on this?
Right. Let's start with the blanket ban.
Yeah.
On families and tenants on benefits. So firstly, it will be illegal officially. It will be illegal to advertise the property as, for example, no children or no DSS. It occasionally can still see that happening. Now, from my perspective, this isn't really big change. It may feel like for some landlords, but actually the no DSS in advertisement has already been challenged in court. And there is one case I know of where a letting agent lost to the tenant who accused them of discriminating by having an advertisement saying no DSS. Now, what that doesn't mean is that you might lose control of your property or who is actually your tenant. So we don't have practices of advertising properties as no DSS. So for us, it's not a big change, but we carry out affordability checks on every tenant. So if you have someone who doesn't meet those affordability levels.
And when you say affordability, do you mean the tenant has to be able to afford the monthly rent as well as taking into account their day-to-day expenses?
Yes, absolutely right. So in the industry, the common denominator is that your monthly income has to be at least 2.5 to perhaps 3 times the monthly rent itself. And there are always other options like requesting guarantors and so on. But ultimately, landlord will still be able to decide who is actually renting their property. But very importantly, you will not be able to refuse a viewing based on the fact that someone doesn't work. That's very, very important. And I stress enough, it has already been challenged in court, but it will become officially illegal when the bill becomes
so you
law.
have to allow everyone to view the property. You cannot discriminate.
That's correct.
But when it comes to sort of vetting, you can dig a little bit deeper into their affordability, their finances, and then make your decision based on that.
Oh yes, absolutely. That you would do that for any tenant, regardless of their background.
Yeah, so it's not so bad,
no,
is it?
I really don't see that as a big change for what we do for our clients here. And as long as you are able to adapt to that and do any changes necessary, I'm confident that you still be able to let the property to whoever you want and whoever you see as a good potential tenant for yourself.
Right. What about our companions, pets?
Yes, that's an interesting one. I should start saying that I'm a pet owner myself. I've got 2 lovely cats. I'm really proud pet owner. But at the same time, being a letting agent and having been a landlord, I fully appreciate the risks that might be coming with letting properties to tenants with pets.
There's also the welfare of the pet to take into
consideration. Oh, absolutely right. Yeah. So the headline here is that tenants will have an implied right to ask a permission to keep pets in their property, which landlord cannot unreasonably refuse. And I stress the word unreasonably. So
because that's a bit of a difficult word,
It
reasonably.
It is indeed. It is indeed. So as with everything, and that goes to quite a few other points we have discussed and will mention as well. A lot of the things we will find in practice, how actually they are going to work. And I guess for us, like estate agents, it's going to be that little bit easier because of the volume of tenancies we deal with, of the practice we pick up from other estate agents and our industry bodies. But ultimately, just quickly, when a tenant will ask for that permission, you will have to make a decision whether it's a reasonable whether you have reasonable grounds to refuse.
So for example, 3rd floor flat, large dog, owner at work all day.
Yes, so that would be certainly, in my opinion, a reasonable ground to refuse. Obviously, a large dog in a flat is not something that I believe can be deemed reasonable. And then on top of that, you've got the welfare of the pet itself, simply because you cannot really look after a dog if you're 8 hours at work and you've got no arrangements. So what the landlords will be able to do once the request comes in.
I was just going to say, are we going to end on a positive note with this one?
Yes, we will. You will be able to ask a tenant for more details. You will have 40 days to make a decision. And most importantly, you will be able to request for tenant to have a pet insurance that protects you from the extra risk of tenant having a pet in the property. Something that you are not able to do just now. So there will be that change as well, giving that extra protection.
Yeah. So that's a win-win for the landlord. It's got to be, passing on the costs.
I think so.
Yeah.
I genuinely think so.
Lovely. Okay. Now I'm going to go on to another subject, which is rent increases. And
no, talking about the ombudsman.
Ooh, oh yeah, that's it. Sorry. Oh, there we go. So sorry about that. Many of you out there have probably heard about an ombudsman, the term. Did you know that there is going to be an introduction of an ombudsman that will start to regulate the letting sector? And on top of that, there will be a new portal, and landlords will have to register themselves as well as their properties. Now, failure to do so could land you with a whopping bill. And if you fraudulently complete the register, again, you could end up with a whacking great bill, at worst case, a prosecution. So I'll just hand over again to Sławek to give you the detail on this section. Thanks.
Right, Louis. So let's start with the ombudsman. So indeed, as a landlord, you will be required to register with ombudsman before you start marketing your property. Now, the idea of ombudsman will be to create a fairer practices in the sector, which will mean that both yourself or a tenant will be able to bring any disputes and any sort of difficult situations to the ombudsman to deal with, because at the moment the only recourse a landlord has is actually to go to court if there are any issues or problems, and we know how that goes. Whereas with ombudsman, there is actually a chance to try to deal with those issues at that point. So as long as it works as intended, Louise, again, I will see that as a benefit as well, if used well by the landlords themselves.
Yes. Okay.
And in terms of the private rented sector database, that's quite straightforward. Again, you and all of your rental properties will have to be registered before you have the right to market them and actually find yourself a new tenant.
So before they can actually market a landlord can actually market their property, they have to register themselves as a landlord and their properties.
Indeed, yes, indeed. And what that means as well, no doubt there will be a cost associated with that, which the landlord will have to pay. So a little bit of more of an admin burden. But the government is promising there to be some benefits to it for the landlords as well. The idea of that private rented sector database is to be a portal, a one-stop shop for all the landlords to find out all that they need about the compliance, the law, and what they need to do to stay within the legal bounds. So if that works, what that means that unlike today, with any changes in the legislation that are taking place, it's really difficult to know where you are at any given moment in time. And you just never know whether there's a new piece of legislation or some amendment to something that already exists, not to mention of actually how to understand it. With this portal, the idea is everything is going to be in one place, and it's supposed to encourage good practice